Hello, this is Angie Yingst, and you're listening to Centered, grounded conversations about the metaphysical. Welcome to Centered. I'm Angie Yingst, your cruise director, and the first person you text with a picture when you find an animal bone on your hike. And I'm here with another episode of Centered, and this is another Q&A episode. We had a lot of questions in December, and I'm just doling them out slowly over time. So as much as you like to ask questions, I love to answer them. So keep them coming, squirrel friends. The question today is from Tanya, and it's a wonderful question. I actually sent it to Kyra Paules, my friend and my cohort here, and she responded with a 30-minute Marco Polo, which I love. And we talked about what a cool, difficult question it is and that we should tackle it together for sure. So I didn't edit this episode much. It didn't need it. It's pretty much as is. And I like to keep it that way because Kyra and I talk about shadow work in our own ways, and we kind of uncover things in our own ways. And I think some of the beauty comes in the hems and haws that we experience. So I'm definitely coming from an energy work shamanic side, and Kyra, as you might know, is a social worker and therapist. She also has training in archetypal analysis from a Jungian perspective. She's at the Jungian Institute right now, and she's a certified shadow retrieval facilitator and trained as a yoga teacher and massage therapist. So she definitely has been around the energy work side as well. So she's a practicing witch and druid, and you can find Kyra online at awintarot.com. And of course, you can find me online at themoonandstone.com. And this conversation is truly one of those conversations where time sort of slips away. And suddenly my plan to tackle a bunch of questions turns into us doing one, but really, really, really in depth. So as always, I hope you enjoy this episode. We love hearing feedback about our conversations and what you want to hear more of and what you want to hear less of. I'm prepping another Q&A episode, of course. So if you have a question for me, I have a record button on my Anchor page. I have one on my website. Feel free to record a question for me, or you can record on your phone or computer and email it to me at Angie@themoonandstone.com. Or you can just write in and let me read your question. I'll also post a kind of AMA type post on Facebook and Instagram. So you're always welcome to put your questions in there. And if you have any topics you want us to cover, just send them along and I'm happy to look into it if I know anything about it. So thanks and enjoy the episode. Tan asked, my question would be, how do you integrate shadow work? Shadow work gives us breakthroughs and revelations, and most of the time I end up not knowing how to integrate it. How do I implement the changes? Sometimes I might even have a glimpse of what I need to do, but actually doing it becomes hard. Maybe ego sabotages your missions with laziness or talks you out of it. How can we integrate our shadow in a way that we don't fall into it again? And then Becca just followed up by saying, can you break down how one can even do shadow work, ID your shadows, etc.? So there's kind of two questions there. So should we just start with what is shadow work, maybe?
Yeah, because I mean, I guess the thing about this question for me, like if this were a client coming to me and saying this, the first thing that would like indicate that something's up here is that word laziness. Do I fall into laziness? Do I fall into my shadow?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that's where the integration is. What integration of a shadow even is maybe not being completely understood. But yeah, so like, I mean, shadow work is kind of a bit of a misnomer, but we say it anyway. But it's you can't really like work or manipulate the shadow. It just is. So it's like when we think about the human shadow, I always think of like the image of our cousins, the chimpanzees or the bonobos, versus the image of like a Victorian man wearing a suit, right?
Yeah.
And like contrasting those images to each other, where it's like, I mean, the chimpanzee throws its poop. The Victorian man absolutely does not. He won't even talk about it or acknowledge that it happens, right? The chimpanzee will just scream randomly because it feels like it. The Victorian man obviously will not do that. The chimp is naked. The Victorian man is suited up in clothes that are structured and meant to give him a certain appearance to others and reflect his social standing. Whereas the chimpanzee, I mean, they also have social standing indicators and stuff like that, but that's much more about their physical bodies and how they use their bodies and everything. So it's like, when we're talking about shadow, we're thinking about that image of the chimpanzee or the raw and wild side of us that in post-industrial revolution is like hidden in shadow, and some of it is perfectly fine. Like, we don't need to throw our poop around like chimpanzees do, but are we perhaps out of touch with an instinctual nature, which we can't listen to, we can't hear out, it can't speak to us, give us insight. We fall into depression, all of that sort of thing. So the thing about laziness for me in this is like, who uses that word, the Victorian man or the chimp?
The Victorian man, of course.
Right. And
It's such a
so,
construct.
yeah, it's absolutely a construct. And so when we're talking about shadow, we're talking about getting rid of the constructs, not forcing the shadow into harder constructs.
Yeah. And I mean, I love what you said, it's like we don't do the shadow work because, but my teacher always used to say, like, you do the shadow work or the shadow does you.
Right.
Which, makes sense to me. But for me, when I think of shadow, I definitely don't think of like, now this is the time I'm just going to do the shadow work, be done with it, hand in my homework, and I'm clear, right?
Yeah, that'll never happen.
Yeah, like I literally be doing shadow work on the same thing for my entire life.
Yeah, no, and that's a really good point too, that it's like it's the same thing even. It's not
Yeah.
even like, all the unexplored territory there. It's sometimes even just the same topic again and again. It's like a spiral. We just understand it a little bit more deeply next time.
Yeah. But
Um,
I think that's so true what you said. It's a misnomer because, so many people ask me, how do you do shadow work? And, what I basically say is you just start by noticing, like you have to name it to tame it. Like it's not mysterious. There's not some gatekeeping happening with shadow work. It's just you start
no,
noticing the thing you want to shift and change. Oh, I'm having this reaction that isn't aligned with the situation happening. So
right.
we're acting out of something else because something else is
Absolutely.
under the surface. So,
Yeah. And um yeah, I mean, within like, ego psychology, it's like you have like your id, ego, and super ego, and your id is your chimpanzee, and your super ego is like, we'll say the image of the Pope or some sort of figure that's like, you better behave this way or else. And that's where the constructs kind of come in. And your ego is not a bad guy. Your ego is you. It's
right.
not a saboteur who's gonna, you know, drag you down to the depths of hell. What it is it's desperately trying to balance, like, my chimpanzee needs to play, but the superego is telling me I need to be productive. And so when I'm stuck in this place, I don't know what the hell to do. I just sit on my butt and I don't do either.
Mhm.
um, and so like your ego is not the saboteur. Your
Right. Your
ego,
ego is trying to get its needs met. That's it.
yes, absolutely. Yeah, and so it is very much like, I mean, when you see that work play thing with people, you do have, like alcoholism is a great example of
Yeah.
that, where, the ego, you can call it a saboteur if you want, but really it's trying to get some need for perhaps play, freedom, something,
Yeah.
a need met for you. Um, so it's like it's really trying to work in your favor. What we really need to listen to is like, okay, laziness, I see you there. That, or, and maybe we need to reframe the judgment. I mean, is this even a fair judgment, or is this a capitalist construct?
Exactly. Oh my gosh, yes.
And then from there, if it is really like, no, but for real, I have been particularly lethargic and unable to do things, it's like, well, then what need hasn't been satisfied that like there's all this downtime that's needed?
Yeah. Or the
Yeah.
defiant child within is
Yeah.
not wanting to do something. Why?
Right.
Um, because I that's something I notice in my clients a lot. It's almost like the defiance doesn't make sense based on what they're telling me their needs are, right? Or what they want.
Yeah.
So they have this like outward want, and then they have the inward want, and
Yeah.
they don't match.
Yeah.
So it's like they're like, why do I keep sabotaging my outward want? You know?
Yeah.
It's like maybe you don't actually want that thing.
Right. Absolutely.
But
Yeah.
I have a friend who I met in recovery. He's since died, but he told me something that I hold on to all the time, which is he was like brutally sexually abused as a child. Okay.
Hmm.
And he said to me, if I didn't find alcohol, I would have been dead.
Right.
Like if I didn't drink alcoholically at age 11 or 12, whenever he found that, he said I would have died
Absolutely.
because he could not, and he didn't have a safe place to process any of that.
Yes.
He was raised in the 50s, 60s. He just couldn't have, he didn't have a safe place to talk about it. So he found alcohol and that worked for a long time. And then it didn't
Yep.
work anymore.
Yeah.
Because then it started interfering with his relationships and his life and, getting arrested and, all that kind of stuff. Because that's the thing about the shadow, right? Is that
Hmm.
it comes out like it wants to be, even though we want to hide it in the corner, it'll
Yes.
come out sideways. And we don't
Hmm.
always understand what that is that's coming out. Like, where did that
Yeah.
come from? Why did I say that when I was drunk? Why did I say that when I was tired?
Yeah.
Um, so
Absolutely. Yeah, and essentially the whole reason that we as human have shadows at all is because of social norms, judgments, stigmas, all of that. Like, I mean, you could say in some ways that, like dogs, domesticated dogs, they might have some amount of super ego that
yeah.
yells at them and stuff like that, and tells them to be a good boy or girl. Um, and really, but they're really one of the only animals that we see with that. In reality, all other animals are not using terms like lazy or hating on themselves for engaging in certain behaviors that they're using to survive. That's purely human post-industrial revolution kind of stuff. Yeah.
That's such a good point. I mean, also, what's interesting is at least, as I've worked on my stuff, I feel like that voice is a hydra, like maybe it's the
Yeah.
voice of the church for a long time. Then I cut that head off, and then my mom's head pops in, or my dad's head pops
Right.
in. And it's
Yes.
just, it doesn't, it's almost like an endless cycle of being told. So even when I've gotten down to the bottom of that, then society kind of pops in. So it's almost impossible to not have a voice in your head that's telling you how it's supposed to be, unless you're completely isolated from other people.
Absolutely. Well, and especially because like a lot of it at least started as stuff that's like good and that we all would agree is like perfectly fine that we keep it in shadow. Like,
Right.
um, when it comes to I mean, again, thinking about primate behavior, I mean, again, they just scream randomly in public. Now, maybe that's not as big of a deal, but we can see why we might have considerations around that. But then there's other things that are kind of a big deal. Like they'll just have sex openly or masturbate openly. They
Yeah.
will again, the poop throwing sort of thing. That's all stuff that for safety and hygiene reasons, we don't just do that. And so that super ego has a point with some things. But it's hard to really, when you have it at all, sometimes it's hard to really keep it in check, to where it doesn't become overblown.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, one of the ways I was taught about shadow was through my shamanic training, because shadow is primarily what a lot of shamanic stuff is trying to access. It's trying to access that which is hidden from the outside. And the way that my shamanic teacher explained it is that our shadow is our wounded child. And the way she said it was, think about the first time that you were embarrassed, or first time that you were hurt. Like that left this kind of permanent place in your soul, right? At that age. And so it's almost as though when you're in daily world, and I'm 49 years old and I'm walking, and someone says something that was like that first embarrassment or first humiliation, that 6-year-old or 7-year-old comes out and says like, oh, I've seen this before, let me take care of it. And they get to drive the bus. So, that's kind of when something shadowy is happening, it's like you're behaving like a child and you don't know why.
Absolutely.
And so she said, like, when you're in that place and you're triggered, you cannot access your wisdom.
Absolutely.
And that would be the reason to do this kind of work. It's not that inner child is being bad. It's saying like, I know how to fight this. Like, I decided next time this happens, I'm going to yell at that person.
Absolutely.
Or I am going to punch them in the face or whatever. And she's like, we just don't do that anymore,
Yeah. I mean, I even had a circumstance at one point where that kind of ended up happening to me, and it really took me by surprise, because it was like I acted completely out of character. Now, truth be told, it was still warranted, and everyone in the situation was like, your reaction was fine. But still, it was me being much more elevated, loud, yelling, saying like absolutely destructive, hurtful things that I would never say in any other context, but it's like I went there. And it was completely because the situation mirrored something that I had experienced when I was 6 years old. And so it was like that's who came out right then and there. And it's quite a learning experience.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing. Triggers never go away, really. We just learn how to deal with them,
Absolutely.
And I think when somebody asks a question like, how do you integrate shadow work? It's exactly the thing you're talking about. Like, where are these words coming from? Sabotage and laziness. And, you were kind of mentioning that earlier. Do you want to talk a little bit about that too?
Yeah.
Like, how do you integrate it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. With integrating it, I mean, I think you're bringing up a really great point. It is kind of like, that example of me being in a situation where I'm being gaslit, not believed, that I start freaking out. The thing for me to do to kind of integrate this shadow in the future would be things like, really identifying that part of me. Like, let's say I want to pretend I'm like a werewolf when I go to that mode. Is like, what does it feel like when the werewolf starts to come out? How do I know I'm going into werewolf territory? And what sort of things can I do to mitigate that as it's happening, or at least just see it, acknowledge it, validate it, which actually goes a very long way to calming it down. That is definitely one of the things. But yeah, I mean, really, when it comes to integrating shadow, it's not just like this, like, oh, I'm gonna force it and there we go. Yep, yeah. I was integrated. It's like
exactly. But that's what people think. They want that quick fix. Like, and that's where they'll
Yes.
come to see someone like me and be
Yeah.
like, I want to integrate my shadow. Can you do it in a ceremony for, shamanic ceremony? And it's like, I can help. Like, those are great things to do at the end of a cycle.
Yeah.
They're wonderful healing sessions to have, but they're not going to do the work for you.
Yes.
The work is
No.
like a long game. It's not a short one. And you
Yes.
have to like make peace with you.
Yeah. And that is what I see a lot in therapy practice too, where it's like I I had I've experienced with clients, and I'm sure I've done it before myself, but where they will essentially be like, no, I don't want to do the work. I'm going to do this one ritual
Yep.
tonight at the full moon.
Yeah.
And that's going to heal my marriage, my life, my body image issues, whatever, just doing this ceremony. And it's unfortunately really missing the point of both like the long-term work and also what ceremony and ritual are actually
Yeah.
for. It's like missing the point of both of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the interesting parts of that when you're talking about ritual and ceremony is they're usually not one thing that you do. Like
Right.
they like, for example, I'm thinking of the ritual of marriage, for example. Like you have
Yes.
a long build up of falling in love and getting to know
Right.
each other and blah, blah, blah. That is that rite of passage that goes from one state to the next. And that's really what
Right.
rituals are, right? You're going
Right.
from one state to the next. So when you have a
Yeah.
ritual to be like, I want to change my marriage right now, I'm going to do a ritual. It just doesn't make sense. It's something you have
No.
to engage in together and do
Absolutely. Yeah.
a long game.
Yeah. Absolutely. And shadow work and shadow integration is definitely the long game. And what I have seen in times where it maybe truly could be said that somebody really integrated a shadow. I mean, it's kind of like what you as a shamanic practitioner would call a soul retrieval.
Yeah.
When I have seen that happen, it happens. I mean, the soul retrieval is the right parallel where I've seen where clients of mine have had a long, long time, and I've experienced this too, of like kind of working on something, stewing on something. It's really hard for a long time, long, 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 long time. And then suddenly one day, poof, it is different. And it's not, again, that's what can fool people is if they just saw poof when it changed, they're like, that's what I want. But they
Yeah.
didn't see that the person for like 2 freaking years or more was like actively working on this and really in the
Absolutely.
trenches of their shit. And then that's when poof it happened. It's like fairy tales are written from they mirror the psyche. And so it's like you think about the transformation of like the prince or the frog into a prince or the beast into a prince.
Yeah.
It's not, like you think about the plot of Beauty and the Beast. Yes, it is that poof, the beast is now a prince again, but there was a whole lead up to that where he was
Yeah.
vicious and nasty and terrible to Belle. Then he starts to see the errors in his ways. He starts to understand what love is and
Yeah.
all of that. And then that's when the poof happens.
Yeah. And with soul retrieval as well, like that isn't work that you do in the beginning.
No.
Not, I mean, certain shamanic societies maybe, but when we do that work now, it really is that the inner child that you're bringing home, the part of the soul that's been lost, needs to feel safe. And you
Yes.
can't feel safe if you're still judging that part of you.
Absolutely.
Right? If that
That's
person
such a
is
good
triggered
point.
and starts crying, you can't say, gosh, why are you crying? Get over it already. That child would retreat again.
Yeah.
And so that's the whole point. Like soul loss isn't about you doing something wrong. And that's why your soul
Yes.
went, it went to protect itself. It went to find somewhere safe that was
Yeah.
away from whatever trauma was happening to you. So when you bring it back,
Absolutely.
it can't have trauma anymore. It can't have abuse.
Yeah.
And if your inner voice is still abusive, that's not going to work. So like when we do soul retrieval, we tell people to act like that age, do things that would soothe that age, like go do coloring books, or go, swing and eat some ice cream and put yourself to bed early. And you do things so that your soul part feels safe again.
Yeah.
That's what struck me about the question.
Yes, no, absolutely. It was definitely self-deprecating.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it was like, okay, that is our signal that like what we think is the shadow issue might not actually be the shadow issue.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's for me, when people ask me as a non psychologist or therapist or counselor, how do I work with shadow? I basically just say, you really need to be super curious about
Yes.
why you do the things you do,
Yes.
and noticing it and wanting to shift and change ways of being. Because we do
Absolutely.
this in recovery, through the 12 steps is really the shadow work that, that it's one way of doing shadow work is to do the 12 steps.
Yes.
Because but it doesn't start with that. It doesn't start with the
No.
heavy stuff first. It starts with accepting that you're an alcoholic or a drug addict or a sex addict or whatever.
Yeah.
Knowing that you're powerless over it, that your life has gotten unmanageable because your life is unmanageable. And then you like sort of believe in a higher power, and then you put your faith.
Yes.
But the fourth and fifth step are the one that people usually leave recovery during.
Yeah.
The fourth step is write down all the harms you've caused other people.
Right.
And that's hard for people. They're like,
That
I'm
is
so
really
afraid of that.
hard.
But what actually we ask people to do, you start by writing all your resentments down.
Wow. Yeah.
So you write everybody who you had a resentment, who you may stay up late thinking about how you could have said something differently. You write all those people down. And we make basically a graph, like we make a chart. So we have 4 columns. The first column is all the people. Second column is what they did to you. The third column is how it affects you. And the fourth column is your role in it. You know? And we go through that whole process. We do all of our resentments, then we do all of our fears, then we do all of our sex behavior that has affected other people or ourselves. And then we go through all of our harms. And usually that harm list is so short because you've covered everybody in the other ones. Like your resentments usually cover your harms that you've done to people. And what happens is you do that, and then you take it to your sponsor and you talk about it. When you go through that process, she or he is looking for a pattern of your behavior and letting you know what your character defects are. And those character defects are essentially shadow, right? They're essentially the coping mechanisms that you've used that don't work anymore. And then we ask to have those removed, and we remove them by acting as if they're gone already.
Yeah.
It's interesting.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one thing too about, shadow work becoming kind of trendy, if you will, and taking off is that there's a lot of misunderstanding about it. And one of the big things that I just noticed too is that there's like all these like journaling activities that are recommended. And if we really like think about what Carl Jung was talking about when he was talking about the shadow, one of the best ways actually to work with our shadow is through our interactions with the other.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, totally.
Yes. It's not just focusing in on ourselves, it's interacting with the other, seeing how we interact with the other. Why do I interact with this other this way? How do I respond to the other's traits? And the other, in a lot of ways, most particularly, most curiously, I guess, would be like thinking about people who are literally like your opposite. So for me, as a young white cis woman, it would very likely be an older Black man, would be my other. How do I relate to that person? Do I see myself relating to that person? What sorts of wisdom of the other might they have to offer me? And one thing that I had really noticed personally is like when I was doing work in the prisons, that was some of the most intense shadow work I had ever done, because
Yeah.
they were, these individuals who on a surface level were my other, and yet deep, deep down, um, in coming to understand them and why things went the way that they did, there was hardly a difference at all in
Yeah.
some cases. And so that was some of the most profound shadow work for me personally. And it really shifted the way that I see other people, their behaviors, and yeah, I don't think I'll ever come back from it. But it was interesting because last night I was discussing with my partner, my other, um, like I want to do a class on shadow for people, since there's a lot of misunderstanding. And I was like, what would be the best shadow work like topics to discuss? Like my teacher who I had learned from, she did stuff on like the mother wound, the father wound, money,
Yeah.
sex, stuff like that.
All the big
um
stuff.
yeah, all the big shadow stuff. And you know what Sean, my partner, says and suggests that I talk about as one of the topics? Talks about lying and the criminal behaviors that we all engage in.
Whoa.
And I was
I
like,
love
oh,
that.
nobody wants to talk about that. But that's like great
Yeah.
shadow work right there, is
I love
getting
that.
real about some of those sorts of things that we all do.
Yeah.
Our excrement we try to hide.
Seriously. But we throw poop in so many other ways, which is so funny.
We
Like
do.
I was thinking, oh gosh, you know what a great topic would be? Women in circle with other women and men in circle with other
Oh
men.
my God, right?
Because that would actually touch on a lot of lying, right? A
Oh
lot of like
yeah.
fitting in, wounding.
Yes. Yeah, all the posturing. Oh my God,
Oh
yeah.
gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think that would be great. Honestly, you have a lot of insight on that from
Oh gosh. Yeah.
running women's and men's groups and doing AA and all of that.
It's interesting. It definitely is. I mean, I think for, one of the interesting things when I did like a fourth and fifth step when I was 5 years in recovery. So I had
Mhm.
done it when I first got sober to stay sober. So I did a lot around my drinking. And
Yeah.
then I hadn't drank for 5 years. I moved to a new place. I got a new sponsor. And I was like not going to a ton of meetings. Every time I went to meetings, I was like, I am so sick of hearing that guy's story. Like I hear he says the same shit every week. Like I'm in the back, just like my brain is just like, that guy is like such a bullshitter. Like everything he says is a lie. And I'm going through this whole thing in my head every time I go to meetings. So I don't want to go to meetings. I'm leaving feeling worse than when I went in there. Right.
Yeah.
So at some point I have like a personal tragedy in my family and I decide I got to really plug into AA. So I go to an AA meeting every day for 90 days and I get a new sponsor. And when I start working with the sponsor, I decide to do the steps. And she was like, okay, do all the steps around, like, do this, do the resentments around everybody in AA who you have a resentment with. And I mean, I had like 10 pages of people that I was resentful of in
Mm.
AA, people I saw once a week for the whole year before that. Like somehow I'd managed to develop that many resentments. Okay. Which were just like, they're an asshole. Like they won't stop talking about themselves. They take up too much time. They share twice, blah, blah, blah. Okay. All that stuff.
Right.
And so she she gave me a paper of emotions. And she said, I would like you to also, after you figure out all the other stuff, write an emotion next to it.
Yeah.
And like I had like judgmental, I wasn't very considerate of their whatever they're going through. Blah, I had a lot of that kind of stuff coming in. And so she had me read my whole list to her. And I'm telling her my list, and she goes, "Oh, what? Could you write lonely next to that?" And I was like, "Okay." And I write lonely. And then the next one comes, she goes, "Oh, would you write lonely next to that?" So I wrote lonely. And when I was done, I was looking at like 50 lonelies on these 10 pages. And I was like, I mean, I could cry. Like, I felt so shelled out. She's like, "It sounds like you're really lonely." And I was like, I could not even identify that. She was
Wow.
like,
Yeah.
"Why are you using judgmentalism in these rooms?" And I was like, I don't know. She's like, "Maybe you don't want to get vulnerable with these people. Maybe
Yeah.
you're trying to find something wrong with them." And
Right.
I felt like I had nothing in me. I have never had that feeling before or since, with just
Mhm.
like being like completely a sketch of Angie.
Yeah.
Because I was like, everything that I thought I knew about myself, I don't know, because
Yeah.
I'm so lonely. And that
Right.
was like, I think that, you know, when I started getting really deep with that, I had to sit with that idea of like, how long have I been lonely? Oh
Yeah.
shit, my whole life, you know, my
Yeah.
whole life.
No, and that is perfect shadow work there because, it's like it could just be like, Angie, why are you being such an asshole and judging everybody all the time?
I
Or it
was.
could be like, are you lonely? Like, what is going on here? Like, this is asshole behavior, but there's a hell of a lot more to asshole behavior than I just want to be an asshole.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly didn't want to be that way. It was causing me suffering
Yeah,
and harm.
absolutely.
But the interesting part was just there was no mention like, "Oh, we're going to do shadow work now." I don't think that
Right.
person would even call it
No,
that, right? They would
no.
never have called it that. But there was such a loving compassion that she gave me during that time.
Yes.
She was so kind. She didn't say, "Man, you're being an," like
Yep.
she could have. And
Yeah,
she has said that to
absolutely.
me, "You're being an asshole," but I wasn't. That was the other part, was I had done enough
Mhm.
work that I wasn't acting out any
Yeah.
longer.
You're just
So
keeping it quiet inside.
all the suffering
Yeah.
was in me
Yes.
over other people's
Absolutely.
behavior, which had nothing to do with me.
Wow.
It was so
Wow.
powerful. It was such a shifter, for me, to understand that I was, for one, causing my own suffering, and two, I was too close to it to see it. I had to
Yes.
get really curious instead of judging my judging. My
Yes.
judging came from a place, and that place was to keep people like at a different level than me, so I couldn't relate to them.
Absolutely.
Because if I saw
Absolutely.
myself in the drunk that was coming in and relapsing every week, that meant I was a drunk who was about to relapse every week.
Yeah.
Because I was there. I mean, I honestly, like, I was in enough suffering that who knows if the next week I would have drank, because it was like
Right.
unbearable to be me.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and I love that though, because that is that learning learning about our shadows through the other. And
Yeah.
like, what judgments do I have about the other, and what might be interesting about that if I look at that a little bit deeper. On one hand you have, like defensiveness that goes with judgment. On the other hand, you also even have sometimes like, I think about particularly with women, with other women, where it's like, oh my God, why is she wearing that? And it's
Yeah.
like, because I'm not allowed to wear that.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh my gosh. So
Yeah.
true.
Yeah.
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 I work with a sponsee that's very thin. She's very beautiful. And we don't talk about that,
Yeah.
except with the way people treat her. And, I'm
Right.
heavy. So it's very interesting to have such similar reactions from people, which is, your body's not like mine, so I'm going to judge it.
Exactly.
She has a different approach. People telling her, you need to eat a sandwich, or you need to,
Mhm.
whatever they say, that's just
Right.
so nasty.
Yes.
And assumptions about her. She's a marathon runner, so she's going to have a different body type than you.
Absolutely.
So, but it's
Yeah.
just interesting because we don't talk about eating disorders. We don't talk about eating at all. We talk
Mhm.
about, how do we deal with that? How do we deal with the
Exactly.
world? So it's very interesting to kind of go through both observing and being observed, and that other people often see our shadows way before we see ours.
Yeah, and that's also a great point too, is like we're not all always too willing to go there, but hey, one good way to find out what your shadow is to ask other people.
Oh my gosh, that's so hard.
You know, this is kind of funny because this touches on the golden shadow, where it's like, you know, within your shadow you also have some things that, you know, riches that might have been lost. Like for example, you know, an alcoholic might that desire for play or fun might also be shadowing out some kind of real musical talent or
Yeah.
artistic talent, right? um so with this golden shadow thing, I remember I had a time with this one client of mine. I stood up at the end of the session and he goes, "Wait a minute, you're shorter than me?" And I was like, "Yeah." I mean, I'm not a very tall person. He's like, "No way, because this whole time I thought you were at least 5'9".
Oh my gosh, that's so
And it was
funny.
so funny though, because then around that same time, I had a couple other people like tell me like that they were surprised I was short, that because of seeing me on camera or talking to me or just like normally I'm sitting in a chair, they thought I was going to be tall. So that's the golden shadow part where, you know, for most of my life, I've always seen myself as shrinking and mousy. And so it's kind of funny to have other people being like, "No, I see a fucking lion. What are you talking
Yes,
about?"
exactly. I was gonna
Yeah.
say that because that's happened to me too. Where when I used to live in Tucson, I always wore these like platform
Oh
heels.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
And my friend came over. She's Mexican, and she walked in the kitchen. I hadn't put my shoes on yet. She's like, "Oh my gosh, you're short." And I was like, I'm 5'5", 5'6". And she was like, "But I thought you were like 6 foot."
Yeah,
And I
no,
mean, I didn't have that many inches of heels. And
right.
we worked together. So we were walking, we were
Yeah.
worked in a restaurant. And she just didn't know. And she's like, "Your presence is so big
No,
compared."
yeah. I was
And
gonna
I'm
say
like, I get that too. Yeah.
you have 6 foot energy. Like
I feel like I should have been.
Oh,
So when okay, let me see if she asked anything else. Shadow work gives us breakthroughs and revelations, which is true. So if somebody's coming to you and they say, "How do we integrate our shadow in a way that we don't fall into it again?"
and say, well, I mean,
I almost feel like that you always will fall into it again. You
right.
know,
That
if
almost
you're
seems
not
like,
conscious of it, you're gonna fall into it again.
yeah, that almost seems like I mean, it just kind of misses what shadow work is a little bit, I think,
Yeah.
is because like, well, what we just talked about with, you know, like understanding that the shadow contains parts like the golden shadow and stuff like
Yeah.
that. I'm not seeing it as, "Oh no, I fell into it." It's more like, "Oh, thank God, a part of me that was lost is now back and I can like give it a home again."
Yeah. And
Yeah.
it
So,
feels like to me, one of the things that maybe we haven't really talked about, but should be is like the radical self compassion you need when you're
yeah,
doing shadow work. It can't come from a place of punishing the shadow because the shadow
absolutely.
isn't acting maliciously against
No.
you. It is
No.
just a wounded part of you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. No, definitely. It's compassion is really kind of make it or break it.
Yeah.
It's You know, I mean, in real life, I saw this mirrored actually, and that's this again is part of why working with incarcerated people was really impactful, because it was very obvious that if you went into session with them or they were talking to people who were judgmental towards them, they immediately had a guard up. They were not going to work with you. They were not going to budge. And why should they? Because here you are walking into a room to meet with them, knowing their criminal record, and based on that, assuming that you know everything about them and their lives and what got them there. And that's completely unfair. And so what was really, really required was to show that, like, I'm not judging you. I have immense compassion for you. And unfortunately, you know, it's funny because I actually had a client say it to me once, something about, you know, the people who do therapy with inmates are hug-a-thugs. Yeah, yeah. I was like, oh, that's nice. And so there's, you know, it's interesting because, I mean, having done that prison work, I know that there's a lot of stigma around being the person who has compassion for these people, because it's like, well, aren't you supposed to be holding them accountable? Is that not why they're fucking already in prison? I don't think I need to go in there and teach them more of a lesson than they've already learned. They're sitting in state prison.
Yeah. I mean, also, not to, and we can cut this out if you want, but you were going in there from, you know, rape cases. And so one of the things that's, I'm sure people really wanted to question you about was the fact that these people were sometimes the rapist, and they were both the rapist and the raped. So
absolutely. Yeah, you don't have to cut this out. I think that this is a really good topic. Yeah, so I was going in with on behalf of the Prison Rape Elimination Act. And so that requires that when inmates are sexually assaulted in prison, that they receive counseling that is confidential, that is from outside of the prison. And so yeah, no, definitely that added layers to it. I had people who had I worked with who had mixed feelings about whether it was a good idea or not to know the criminal record of the clients. And some people were like, no, I can't do that because I would judge them too much. And while I understand that, I would always urge people that it's very important that maybe you get past that. Because what got them in prison was a defense mechanism of theirs. That's really fucking important to know that, and it's really important to not judge it. And so yeah, no, there's a lot of judgment around it because you know, it is real world shadow work. And so it's highly judged. I mean, we that's why we choose to judge ourselves. I can't just excuse this part of me that's mean or malicious. I can't just excuse, but compassion is not excusing. As you can see in the example with your AA meeting, that woman was incredibly compassionate, and at no point was she not holding you accountable.
Exactly. And I think that's what's important. Like, it's never a zero-sum game. Like, you can only have one feeling and that's it. You know, it is, we can have complex emotions and hold them. We can also, like, not approve of what that person did in the past and also know that they didn't deserve to be raped by someone, you know.
Exactly.
Like, we don't do that as punishment. So
exactly, absolutely, 100%. Yeah, no, and it's yeah, it's unfortunate that in our society we see it that way, but it really is like incarcerated people, as well as, you know, disabled people, as well as Black and brown people, are the shadow of society. And the reason I kind of more specifically even say like incarcerated people and disabled people is because of what we do to them, which proves that they are the shadow. Somebody does something we don't like and we send them away to, you know, a group home, we don't have to think about them, or to a prison and we don't have to think about them, and that just removes them from society and nobody else has to think about it ever again. And that's what we do with our shadows too. It's the exact same behavior. Okay, I don't like this, I'm gonna send it to prison. And unfortunately, what happens is that once our shadow is in prison, it does exactly what incarcerated men in particular do, and it pumps iron and it gets ready for the day it's going to get out, and then it's going to get you good.
Yeah.
Like there's this air of that. And so it's like incarcerated individuals are the shadow of our society, the stain that we just want to forget about. And we can't just erase people. That doesn't happen, and we can't just erase parts of ourselves.
Yeah, it's inhumane.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's interesting. I was making this connection because I was, watching TikTok this morning, and there was a woman on talking about, she's a person that does gentle parenting, meaning she doesn't yell at her children or hit her children. And she was in the airport, and a woman yelled at her child. Her child was making like a repetitive noise that was loud, which children do. She was 3. Her child is 3.
Oh, okay.
And the mom came, to talk to the dad because she was in the bathroom and heard this, and then walks out. The dad's minding the child and says like, "Oh, what have you done already?" Right? Like, what did you say? How did you say it? Blah, blah, blah. And then as she's discussing with the father how they're going to handle it, this woman yells across the whole airport, "Little girl, you be quiet right now. That's very annoying, and you're upsetting a lot of people, and you shut up," kind of thing. And the parents were like, "We don't yell at our kid." And her kid was humiliated, embarrassed, and got quiet because she's never even been around someone who yells at her.
Right.
And the mom was like, "What do I do in this moment? I could yell back. And what am I showing my kid?" Like, we are constantly facing, as parents, doing the behavior we're asking our children not to do in that moment.
Absolutely.
And I have done it, I've yelled at my kids when I've lost my patience. And I always feel terrible about it, because what am I showing them? That it's just the loudest person, the biggest person, who's going to win that argument.
Yeah.
And that's not fair either. So it's interesting too, like when we talk about shadow, like we see that played out over and over and over again in our lives,
Yes. No, that's great that you brought up parenting, because that's definitely like a big one for shadow for people.
Well, I mean, when I was parent, when I became a parent, there was so much that I learned about my life. Like when my kids were the same ages as when stuff happened to me, I was like, they're so little. Like, they're so little.
Yeah.
And this, somebody yelled at me at that age or hit me at that age. And she's like, how can you hit a baby? Like, it doesn't make sense to me. But then the other part is, my kids they drive me crazy when they're screaming and yelling and playing. Right? Like it's a sensory nightmare.
Right. I was going to say, kids are sensory nightmares for me, not going to lie.
Well, I get panicked. Like I get like anxious and panicked. And I realized, because my dad, who probably was, on the spectrum at some point, I mean, he certainly had OCD. He had depression, and he was an alcoholic. So if we played too loud, or if we laughed, if he would yell at us and put us in timeout. And so I started to realize that when my kids get angry, I get anxious because I got in trouble every time I was loud. Absolutely. And so and I could see the cycle, which is probably my dad, who had very violent parents.
Right.
Every time he was a loud kid and they were alcoholic, they beat him.
Right.
So every time I was loud, he got anxious and yelled at us. He never hit us. He wasn't that kind of dad.
Yeah.
And then when my kids got anxious, they would be loud. I start getting anxious, going like, I'm going to get punished. When I started questioning it, that's what I was thinking. You're going to get in trouble.
Yeah.
And I had to go like, they're kids, Angie. This is exactly what you want them to do. They're joyous. No one has beaten the loudness and fun out of them yet.
Yeah.
Like my father,
Yeah.
which was an interesting thing to realize. Like, I had anxiety because of all, like, from behaviors that were, happening 75 years ahead of time, it's just interesting. Like, you have to reckon with that, like, almost ancestral shadow that kind of pops up and is just this weird thing. So when my kids are anxious, I have to remove, or when my kids are playing and laughing and wrestling and doing all that, I remove myself. I put myself in timeout because my anxiety could come out as yelling, and I don't want that to.
Well, and that's a great point about the integrating shadow thing, like again, where it's like how you handle that is kind of how we deal with it then. We can't always expect that it's just gonna go away. Some of the wounds that we have can be healed totally. Some are gonna leave a good bit of scar tissue, and some of them might have hit something really important. We might have actually lost like a metaphorical leg from it. And so like some of the woundings are more permanent than others, and it's becoming aware of what they are, removing yourself from situations where you're going to be triggered unnecessarily.
Well, this was such an awesome conversation.
Yeah, this
is a great question.
We had a lot.
I know. I know. I just realized we've been talking for about an hour. So. Thanks for listening to Centered with me, Angie Yingst. If you'd like to send me a question or comment about this show or any shows, you can send them to Angie@themoonandstone.com.